Before science found its language, medicine spoke in symbols, stars, and smoke. The alchemists of the Middle Ages searched for gold, but also for healing, purity, and the secret spark of life itself. Their laboratories glowed with strange colors, their notebooks mixed prayers with recipes, and every experiment blurred the line between faith and discovery. Tonight, we step into their world, where Mercury met moonlight, where failure meant revelation, and where the dream of eternal life shaped the dawn of modern science. It is a story of wonder, obsession, and the thin line that once separated the healer from the magician. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and drift into the golden haze where medicine first met magic. If you enjoy wandering through these forgotten corridors of history, consider journeying with us again, where every tale unearths something strange, something beautiful, something lost to time. Picture this: China, 210 BC. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who built the Great Wall, who unified an entire civilization, who commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, is dying. Not from battle wounds, not from assassination, but from the very thing he thought would make him immortal. For years, his alchemists have been working day and night, mixing mercury with sulfur, grinding cinnabar into fine powders, heating mysterious substances in bronze vessels. They promised him the impossible, eternal life, and he believed them. Why would he not? These were not charlatans off the street. These were the most learned men in China, practitioners of an ancient art that combined chemistry, philosophy, and something that looked an awful lot like magic. So the emperor swallowed their pills, month after month, year after year. Mercury coursing through his veins, accumulating in his organs, slowly poisoning the most powerful man on Earth. And here is the thing that haunts me, the irony that makes this story so chilling. He died believing he was getting stronger. His alchemists told him the tremors were a sign of transformation. The confusion was enlightenment beginning. The weakness was his mortal body preparing to shed its limitations. Right up until the end, he thought it was working. But it was not immortality that found Emperor Qin Shi Huang on that journey to eastern China. It was mercury poisoning. The very substance meant to perfect him had destroyed him from the inside out. Now you might be thinking, how could anyone be that foolish? How could the smartest people of their time, people who built empires and created technologies we still use today, believe that swallowing liquid metal would make you live forever? But here is what fascinates me about this story, what keeps me awake thinking about it. They were not stupid, not even close. They were working with the best information they had, and in the ancient world, that information told them something that actually made perfect sense at the time. Let me take you back even further. Egypt, around 300 AD, the city of Alexandria. Imagine the greatest library humanity had ever built, scrolls from every corner of the known world. And in a workshop somewhere in that magnificent city, a man named Zosimos was bent over his experiments. Zosimos was not just mixing random things together hoping for magic. He was systematic, methodical. He documented everything. He was asking fundamental questions about the nature of matter itself. If you could purify gold, could you purify the human soul? If base metals could transform into noble ones, could not the human body transform too? Could not disease transform into health? These were not crazy questions in the ancient world. They were philosophical, almost poetic. And you know what? Zosimos was one of the first people to actually write down what we would call laboratory procedures. He described equipment that we still use versions of today. He talked about distillation, about heating and cooling, about observation and repetition. He even did something that surprises most people when they first hear about it. He addressed much of his work to a woman. Her name was Theosebia, and she was his student. In ancient Alexandria, when women had almost no rights in most of the world, here was an alchemist taking a female pupil seriously, teaching her the secrets of their craft. And Theosebia was not the only woman in this world. There was another, even earlier, a figure so important that we still use her invention in kitchens today, though most of us have no idea where the name comes from. Mary the Jew, sometimes called Maria Hebrea. Mary lived sometime between the 1st and 3rd century AD, and while most of her writings are lost to history, we know she invented something brilliant. Have you ever used a double boiler? That gentle way of heating chocolate or making delicate sauces, where you put one pot inside another pot of boiling water? That is called a bain-marie, Marie's bath, named after Mary the Jew, who invented it almost 2,000 years ago for her alchemical experiments. Think about that for a second. You are making hollandaise sauce in your kitchen using a technique invented by an ancient alchemist who was trying to discover the secrets of immortality. History is wild, is it not? But all of these early alchemists, Zosimos, Mary, and countless others whose names we will never know, they were all working from the same basic understanding of reality. And to understand why their cures seem so strange to us, we have to understand how they saw the world. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are an ancient philosopher. You look around and you see, well, everything seems to be made of combinations of basic things, right? There is earth, solid, stable, heavy. There is water, fluid, cool, adaptable. There is air, invisible, light, everywhere. And there is fire, transformative, dangerous, powerful. This was the four elements theory, and it was not just some primitive superstition. It was actually a sophisticated attempt to categorize all of existence. Every substance, every material, every liquid and solid, they were all combinations of these four basic elements in different proportions. And here is where it gets interesting for medicine. If everything is made of these four elements, then the human body must be too, right? And if you are sick, that means your elements are out of balance. Too much fire makes you feverish. Too much water makes you, well, too watery, I suppose. The theory had a certain elegant logic to it. So the goal of medicine, the goal of alchemy, was to restore balance, to transform the diseased state back into the healthy state. Just like you might transform lead into gold by adjusting its elemental composition, you could transform a sick body into a healthy one. But there was another name that echoed through every alchemist's laboratory, a figure so legendary that we are still not entirely sure he ever existed: Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. The name itself is a fusion, a blending of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, wisdom personified, knowledge made divine. The texts attributed to Hermes, and there were many of them, collectively called the Hermetica, they promised that everything was connected. The famous phrase, "as above, so below," came from these writings. What happens in the heavens happens on earth. What happens in the cosmos happens in the human body. If you could understand the stars, you could understand disease. If you could perfect matter, you could perfect the soul. Can you see how intoxicating this would be? This was not just chemistry, this was not just medicine. This was a complete philosophy of existence, a way of understanding everything from the smallest grain of sand to the largest star in the sky. And the promise, oh, the promise was magnificent. The Philosopher's Stone, have you heard of it? Not just a way to make gold, though that was certainly part of the appeal. No, the real goal was the universal panacea, a cure for all disease, all suffering, all death itself. Imagine being a physician in ancient Alexandria or medieval Paris, and you genuinely believe that somewhere, hidden in the right combination of substances, heated at the right temperature, mixed in the right proportions, there is a cure for everything. Every cancer, every infection, every ache and pain and creeping mortality. You would spend your whole life searching, would you not? You would try everything, and I mean everything. Which brings us to why Emperor Qin Shi Huang and countless others did what they did. They were not being foolish, they were being hopeful. They looked at the evidence around them. Metals did change color when heated. Substances did transform in crucibles. Bodies did sometimes heal with the right treatments. And they thought, if transformation is possible in the laboratory, why not transformation from mortal to immortal? The tragedy is that they were half right. They were discovering real chemistry, real pharmacology, real medicine, but they were mixing it with philosophy and mysticism so thoroughly that they could not always tell which was which. Mercury really does have medical properties. It can kill parasites, for instance, but it is also one of the most toxic substances on Earth. They were standing at the very beginning of science, when experiment and belief were still tangled together, when observation and hope were impossible to separate. And you know what keeps me up at night thinking about this? We like to believe we are so much smarter now. We look back and think, how could they be so wrong? But I wonder, what are we absolutely certain about right now that future generations will look back on and shake their heads at? What medicines are we taking? What beliefs are we holding that in 1,000 years will seem just as bizarre as ground-up mummy powder? It is humbling, honestly. These alchemists were the scientists of their age. They were curious, dedicated, willing to spend decades in laboratories searching for truth. They were wrong about a lot of things, but they were wrong in ways that eventually led to being right. Every failed experiment, every poisoned emperor, every strange cure that did not work, all of that eventually taught us what does work. So as we continue this journey together, I want you to hold that thought. We are not here to mock the past. We are here to understand it, to see how the strangest chapters of history led to the world we live in now. To appreciate that the path from magic to medicine was long, winding, and filled with fascinating, brilliant, sometimes tragic people who were doing their absolute best with the knowledge they had. But our story is just beginning. We have met the ancient alchemists, seen the birth of their strange and wonderful art. We have watched an emperor die from his dream of immortality. Now, in just a moment, we are going to step inside an actual alchemist laboratory. And trust me, you will not believe what we find there. The equipment they used, the symbols they drew, the careful procedures that looked like magic but were actually the very beginnings of modern chemistry. Stay with me. Dim those lights a little more. Get comfortable, because the deeper we go into this world, the stranger and more beautiful it becomes. So, let us push open that heavy wooden door and step inside. The first thing that hits you is not what you see, it is what you smell. Sulfur, sharp and acrid, mixing with something metallic, something earthy, something you cannot quite identify but makes your nose wrinkle. The air is thick, almost chewy, filled with smoke from a furnace that has been burning continuously for days, maybe weeks. Your eyes adjust to the dim light. Candles flicker in the corners, but most of the illumination comes from the furnace itself, casting dancing shadows across walls covered in strange diagrams. Circles within circles, symbols that look almost like letters but are not quite. Drawings of serpents eating their own tails. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there are vessels. Glass bottles in shapes you have never seen before. Some tall and thin with necks that curve like a swan's. Others round and fat like pregnant bellies. Clay pots sealed with wax. Bronze containers with tight-fitting lids. Mortars and pestles of different sizes, stained with residues of 100 different substances. This is a 15th century alchemist's laboratory, and it is both more scientific and more mystical than you could possibly imagine. Let me paint you a more complete picture, because these laboratories were absolutely fascinating spaces. In the corner, you would find the athanor, the special alchemical furnace. Not just any furnace, mind you. This was designed to maintain a constant, gentle heat for weeks or even months at a time. Because the great work, the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, could not be rushed. It required patience, endless, exhausting patience. The athanor had multiple chambers, different levels of heat. The alchemist could control the temperature with remarkable precision, feeding it carefully measured amounts of charcoal. Some athanors were shaped like towers, others like eggs. And here is something that makes me smile. Many alchemists gave their furnaces names, talked to them like they were living things, because in a way, they were convinced they were creating life itself. Then there were the alembics. Oh, these were beautiful. Have you ever seen one? They are these gorgeous glass vessels with long, thin necks that curve downward. The alchemist would heat a substance in the round bottom part, and as it vaporized, the steam would rise up through that elegant neck, then cool and condense, dripping into a collection vessel. It is distillation, pure and simple, the same process we use today to make whiskey or purify water or create essential oils. But to the medieval alchemist, it was so much more than that. They believed they were separating the spiritual essence from the physical body, the soul from the matter. They were not just purifying liquid, they were purifying existence itself. And here is where it gets really interesting. These alembics, that process, it came to Europe from the Islamic world. The word comes from the Arabic al-anbic, which itself came from the Greek ambics. You see how knowledge traveled? From ancient Greece to the Islamic Golden Age, where brilliant scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan, known as Geber in Latin, refined and expanded these techniques. Then to medieval Europe, where they became the foundation of chemistry. Geber was writing in the 8th century in present-day Iraq, and his works were so advanced, so systematic, that people studied them for the next 1,000 years. He described chemical processes with a clarity that was breathtaking. How to create strong acids, how to purify metals, how to build equipment that would not break under extreme heat. But he also wrapped everything in layers of mystical symbolism, partly because he genuinely believed in the spiritual dimension of the work, and partly, let us be honest, because he did not want just anyone stealing his secrets. Which brings us to one of the strangest aspects of alchemical laboratories, the codes. Imagine you are an apprentice, and your master hands you a manuscript. You are so excited. Finally, the secrets. You open it up, and you see a drawing of a green lion eating the sun, a king and queen getting into a bath together, a skeleton rising from a black crow, 7 birds representing 7 planets, a red man and a white woman dancing. What does any of that mean? Well, that is exactly the point. Alchemists developed this incredibly complex symbolic language that only the initiated could understand. The green lion might represent a certain type of acid. The king and queen could be different metals joining in a chemical reaction. The crow could represent the first stage of transformation, when everything turns black from heating. They called this stage nigredo, and it was supposed to represent death before rebirth. Here is a real example that I find fascinating. There is a symbol that shows up over and over in alchemical texts, the Ouroboros, that serpent eating its own tail. What does it mean? Well, it depends on a context. Sometimes it represents the unity of all things. Sometimes it represents a process that feeds back into itself, like when you redistill something multiple times. Sometimes it represents eternity, infinity, the cycle of death and rebirth. One symbol, dozens of meanings, and you had to figure out which one applied to your specific experiment. Now, you might be thinking, why all the secrecy? Why not just write heat Mercury to 350 degrees or whatever? Part of it was practical. Alchemists often worked for wealthy patrons, and if everyone knew how to do what you did, well, you would be out of a job pretty quickly. But there was something deeper too. They genuinely believed that alchemical knowledge was dangerous, that it could be misused, that the secrets of transformation should only be entrusted to those who had proven themselves spiritually worthy. There is actually a beautiful humility in that, is there not? They saw their work as sacred, not just technical. The laboratory was not just a workplace, it was a temple. But let us talk about the thing they were all searching for, the ultimate goal, the philosopher's stone. Now here is something that surprises most people. Nobody could agree on what this thing actually was. Was it a stone, a powder, a liquid? What color was it? What did it taste like? Could you touch it, or would it dissolve your flesh? The descriptions are all over the place, and I find that absolutely fascinating, because it tells us something important. Nobody had actually made it. They were all guessing, all theorizing, all hoping. Some alchemists described it as a red powder, the color of rubies with a brilliance like glass. Jan Baptista van Helmont, a 16th century Flemish alchemist, said it was saffron-colored, in the form of a heavy powder. He claimed he had seen it, though not made it himself. Others said it was a solid stone, dark red like congealed blood. The famous alchemist and physician Paracelsus, and do not worry, we are going to spend a lot more time with this character later, described it as a ruby-like object that could cure any disease and transform metals. But here is my favorite description, from a text called the Rosarium Philosophorum. It is called a stone not because it is like a stone, but only because by virtue of its fixed nature, it resists the actions of fire as successfully as any stone. So it is called a stone, but it is not actually a stone. It just acts like one. Clear as mud, right? The descriptions got even wilder. Some said it was white, others black, others a shifting rainbow of colors depending on what stage of creation you had reached. Some said it weighed almost nothing, defying all natural law. Others said it was impossibly heavy, dense with concentrated power. But here is my favorite description, from a text called the Rosarium Philosophorum. It is called a stone, not because it is like a stone, but only because by virtue of its fixed nature, it resists the actions of fire as successfully as any stone. So it is called a stone, but it is not actually a stone. It just acts like one. Clear as mud, right? The descriptions got even wilder. Some said it was white, others black, others a shifting rainbow of colors depending on what stage of creation you had reached. Some said it weighed almost nothing, defying all natural law. Others said it was impossibly heavy, dense with concentrated power. The truth is, the philosopher's stone was probably less a physical object and more a concept, an ideal, a goal that drove people to experiment and observe and document. And in chasing this impossible dream, they discovered real things, important things. Let me tell you a story that perfectly captures this paradox. The story of how an alchemist accidentally discovered the first element in over 1,000 years, and he thought he had found the secret of life itself. Hamburg, Germany, 1669. A man named Hennig Brand is in his laboratory, and he is desperate. He has poured his entire fortune into alchemy, sold his pharmacy, spent his first wife's inheritance, married a second wealthy wife, and started spending her money too. He is absolutely convinced he is on the verge of the breakthrough that will make it all worthwhile. And he has a theory. A strange, kinda gross theory, but stay with me here. Brand believes that since urine is gold-colored, it must contain some essential connection to gold itself. Remember, this is the logic of alchemy. Similarities in appearance suggest similarities in essence. So, if he can just isolate the right substance from urine, concentrate it properly, apply it to base metals, gold, obviously. So, Hennig Brand begins collecting urine, lots of it. He lets it sit for days, letting it putrefy. The smell must have been absolutely unbearable. Can you imagine? His whole laboratory reeking of decomposing urine. His wife must have been thrilled. He boils it down, reducing gallons and gallons to a thick syrup. Then he heats this syrup in his athanor, his special furnace, to extreme temperatures. He is following a procedure he is convinced will work. Any day now. Any day. And then something extraordinary happens. As the residue heats, it begins to glow, a soft greenish-white light emanating from the vessel. In the darkness of his laboratory, illuminated only by the furnace and now this ethereal glow, Brand must have felt his heart stop. This was it. This was the light of transformation, the glow of the philosopher's stone being born. He watches, transfixed, as the substance continues to glow. He takes some out, and in the darkness, he can write with it, leaving trails of cold light. It is like capturing starlight in a bottle, like holding a piece of the divine. Hennig Brand believes, truly believes, that he has unlocked the secret of life itself. He has not, of course. What he has discovered is phosphorus, the 13th element to be scientifically identified, the first element discovered since ancient times. He stumbled onto a chemical element through sheer accident while chasing an alchemical fantasy. But here is what I love about this story. Brand's method was actually pretty good chemistry. Horrible hypothesis, but solid technique. By collecting, concentrating, and carefully heating urine, he was unknowingly extracting phosphorus, which is present in human waste. His procedure was systematic. He documented everything. He could replicate his results. He was doing science. He just thought he was doing magic. And this, right here, is the beautiful paradox of alchemy. The methods were becoming scientific, even while the goals remained mystical. The equipment was getting more sophisticated, the procedures more careful, the observations more detailed. The alembics and athanors and careful heating, these were not magical tools. They were laboratory equipment, and they worked according to natural laws. The alchemists were learning those laws through experience, through trial and error. Even if they explained them in terms of spiritual transformation, every time they distilled a substance and noticed that it boiled at a specific temperature, they were learning about physical properties. Every time they mixed two things and watched them react, they were learning about chemical interactions. Every time an experiment failed, they were gathering data, even if they did not think of it that way. The laboratory, with all its strange symbols and mystical language, was actually the birthplace of the scientific method. The alchemists were asking good questions and designing experiments to answer them. They just had not quite let go of the idea that everything had to mean something beyond the physical. Can you picture it now? Can you see that smoky, smelly, fascinating space where mysticism and chemistry were dancing together? Where every glass vessel contained both a substance and a symbol? Where the boundary between science and spirituality had not quite been drawn yet? These laboratories existed all over Europe, all over the Islamic world, all across Asia, in Prague and Paris and Isfahan and Beijing, in palace basements and university corners and private homes. Thousands of people spending their lives in these strange liminal spaces, convinced they were on the verge of unraveling reality itself. Some were con artists, sure. Some were delusional, but many, maybe most, were genuine seekers. They were curious about the world. They wanted to understand how things worked. They wanted to heal people, to ease suffering, to push back against death and disease. They just happened to believe that the way to do all that was through transformation. Spiritual transformation, physical transformation, the transformation of lead into gold and sickness into health and death into life. And you know what? In a way, they were right. Not about the philosopher's stone, not about transmuting metals through spiritual purification, but about transformation itself. Because these laboratories did transform things. They transformed superstition into science, belief into knowledge, mystery into understanding. Every time an alchemist carefully noted that heating a substance to a certain temperature produced a specific result, they were building the foundation for chemistry. Every time they invented a new piece of equipment or refined a technique, they were advancing human knowledge. Every failed experiment was teaching them something true. The glowing phosphorus in Henning Brand's laboratory was not the philosopher's stone, but it was something real, something that could be studied, understood, used, something that would eventually light up the world in ways Brand could never have imagined. And that pattern, chasing impossible dreams and finding real discoveries along the way, that is the story of alchemy in a nutshell. But we are not done exploring these laboratories yet, not by a long shot, because some of the substances the alchemists worked with, well, they were not just disappointing when they failed to work as promised. Some of them were actively deadly, beautiful, seductive, and absolutely lethal. And there is one substance in particular that shows up in almost every alchemist's laboratory across every culture. A liquid metal that flows like water, that shimmers like silver, that seemed to embody transformation itself. The alchemists were obsessed with it. Physicians prescribed it for everything from syphilis to sadness. Emperors swallowed it, seeking immortality, and it killed more people than we will ever be able to count. I am talking, of course, about Mercury, and the strange, tragic, fascinating relationship between this toxic metal and the history of medicine, well, that is a story that deserves its full attention. There is something almost hypnotic about Mercury, is there not? If you have ever seen it in person, and most of us have not because we are smart enough now to know better, but if you have, you will never forget it. That liquid silver pooling and splitting and reforming. Those perfect little spheres rolling across a surface like drops of metal rain. It catches the light in ways that seem almost alive, almost magical. The Romans called it quicksilver. Quick meaning alive, moving, animated. And they were not wrong. Among all the metals humans have discovered, mercury is the strange one. The one that refuses to behave like the others. It flows, it evaporates, it seems to transform from liquid to vapor to solid and back again. For the alchemist, mercury was not just another substance. It was the substance, the key to everything. One of the three essential principles, mercury, sulfur, and salt, that they believed made up all of matter. Mercury represented the spirit, the volatile, the transformative essence of existence itself. And if Mercury embodied transformation, well, could it not transform your body too? Could it not cure disease? Could it not grant eternal life? Spoiler alert, it absolutely could not. But that did not stop physicians from prescribing it for nearly 2,000 years. Let me take you back to ancient Rome, to the gladiatorial arena. Not during the fights, after. When the sand is dark with blood, and the crowd has gone home, and the physicians move among the wounded, trying to save what they can. A gladiator lies there with a deep gash across his thigh. It is not immediately fatal, but infection almost certainly will be. The physician has a treatment, though. He pulls out a small vial containing a gray ointment, mercury mixed with fat. He packs it directly into the wound. Now, here is the fascinating thing. Sometimes this actually worked. Not because mercury was healing anything, but because it is toxic enough to kill bacteria. It is a terrible antibiotic, causing more harm than good. But in an era before we understood germ theory, when most wounds got infected and most infections killed you, sometimes, just sometimes, the mercury killed the infection before it killed the patient. The gladiator survives. The physician's reputation grows. Mercury must be a miracle cure, right? This is how medical myths are born, from partial truths and survivor bias and desperate hope. But the Romans were not the only ones fascinated by mercury. In China, remember, alchemists were already using it in their immortality elixirs by the 3rd century BC. They would heat cinnabar, mercury sulfide, that beautiful red mineral, and collect the liquid mercury that condensed from the vapor. Then they would mix it with other substances, perform elaborate rituals, and convince emperors to swallow it. The Chinese alchemists genuinely believed that since mercury was the only metal that was liquid at room temperature, since it flowed and changed and seemed alive, it must contain the secret of eternal fluidity, eternal change, eternal life. The irony is almost painful, is it not? They were giving people the exact opposite of eternal life. They were administering chronic poisoning, one dose at a time. And here is what really gets me. They were not stupid about it, not entirely. There are Chinese medical texts from as early as the 11th century where physicians like Avicenna are recommending mercury only for external use. They had observed that people who took mercury internally often got sick, tremors, confusion, weakness, death. But the allure was too strong, the promise too seductive, and there was always someone willing to believe that they had figured out the secret, that they could purify the mercury enough, combine it with the right substances, say the right prayers, and make it safe. Fast forward to Europe in the late 15th century, and suddenly mercury goes from being a specialized alchemical substance to being a mainstream medicine. Why? Because of a disease that terrified Europe more than plague, more than leprosy, more than anything they had encountered before: syphilis. Now, historians still debate exactly where syphilis came from. Some think Columbus's crew brought it back from the Americas. Others think it was already in Europe but mutated into a more virulent form. Either way, by the 1490s, it was spreading like wildfire across Europe, and it was horrifying. The symptoms started subtly, a small sore that healed on its own. People thought they had been cured, but weeks or months later, rashes would appear. Then the disease would seem to go dormant again. And then, years later, it would come roaring back with devastating effect. Lesions eating through flesh, bones deteriorating, minds destroyed by neurosyphilis. Physicians were desperate for a treatment, any treatment. And someone, and we are not entirely sure who first had this idea, suggested mercury. The logic, if you can call it that, went something like this. Syphilis causes sores and lesions. Mercury, when applied topically, causes the skin to peel and shed. Maybe the mercury is helping the body expel the disease. Maybe if we make the patient salivate profusely, which mercury does, we are helping them purge the illness from their system. It was based on the old humoral theory of medicine, the idea that diseases were caused by imbalances in bodily fluids, and that the cure was to rebalance those fluids through purging, sweating, bleeding, or salivating. So, mercury became the standard treatment for syphilis. And the ways they administered it, well, they were inventive and absolutely horrifying. The most common method was mercury rubs. The physician would prepare an ointment of mercury mixed with lard or butter, and the patient would rub this into their skin every day for weeks. The mercury would be absorbed through the skin, entering the bloodstream, accumulating in organs. Patients would begin to salivate uncontrollably. Their teeth would loosen and fall out. Their gums would become so swollen they could barely eat. The smell from their mouths was reportedly unbearable, a sweet, metallic odor that marked them as mercury patients. But it got worse. Some physicians believed that more aggressive treatment was better, so they developed the fumigation method. Picture this, and I apologize in advance for how disturbing this is going to be. The patient would be placed in a wooden box, like a cabinet, with only their head sticking out through a hole in the top. Inside the box, on the floor, a dish of liquid mercury. Underneath the box, a fire. As the fire heated the box, the mercury would vaporize. The patient would sit there, naked, breathing normally with their head outside, but their entire body enveloped in mercury vapor for hours, sometimes multiple sessions per week for months. Can you even imagine the heat, the claustrophobia, breathing air outside the box while your skin absorbed one of the most toxic substances known to humanity? And this was considered cutting-edge medical treatment. There is a saying from that era that I find both darkly funny and profoundly sad. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Meaning you catch syphilis in one night of passion, and then you spend the rest of your life being treated with mercury. But here is the thing that kept me up thinking about this. Sometimes it seemed to work. Not because mercury was curing syphilis, but because the disease has a natural cycle. It goes dormant on its own for years at a time. So a patient would undergo mercury treatment, the syphilis symptoms would disappear, as they were going to anyway, and everyone would conclude the mercury had worked. The patient might not show symptoms again for a decade. And when they did, well, maybe they just needed more mercury. The logic was insane, but it was self-reinforcing. And here is what really blows my mind. Physicians kept using mercury to treat syphilis well into the 20th century, the 1950s in some places. This is not medieval history. This is recent enough that your grandparents might remember it. Even after penicillin was discovered in 1928 and proved to be far more effective and far less toxic, there were doctors who still believed in mercury, who still prescribed it, who still subjected patients to these treatments that we now know were causing brain damage, kidney failure, and death. Why? How could medical practice be so resistant to change? Part of it was institutional inertia. Mercury treatment for syphilis had been standard practice for 400 years. Medical textbooks taught it. Experienced physicians recommended it. There was an entire infrastructure built around it. Clinics, specialized equipment, treatment protocols. But there was something else too, something psychological. Doctors had invested so much in this treatment, their reputations, their careers, their understanding of disease, that admitting it was all based on a mistake, that they had been poisoning patients for centuries, was almost impossible to accept. There is a quote from an 18th century physician that captures this perfectly. He wrote, "Mercury acts in this disease by abstracting morbid excitement from the brain to the mouth, by removing visceral obstructions, and by changing the cause of our patient's complaints and fixing them wholly upon his sore mouth." Read that again. The goal of the treatment was to make the patient so sick from mercury poisoning, the sore mouth, the drooling, the loose teeth, that they would forget about their original disease. That is not medicine. That is, I do not even know what to call that. Benjamin Rush, who signed the Declaration of Independence and was one of the most respected physicians in early America, was a huge advocate of mercury treatment. He prescribed it for almost everything: syphilis, yellow fever, typhoid, even hypochondria. He had this theory that mercury abstracted morbid excitement from the brain to the mouth. In other words, if you can make someone salivate enough, their mental health problems will improve. Which is not how brains work at all. But Rush was brilliant in other ways. He advocated for humane treatment of the mentally ill, opposed slavery, pushed for public health reforms. He just happened to be catastrophically wrong about Mercury. Smart people can have terrible blind spots. And Mercury was not just a European obsession. In India, traditional Ayurvedic medicine used mercury preparations for centuries. In China, as we have discussed, it was central to alchemical medicine. In the Islamic world, physicians like Al-Razi in the 9th century were writing about mercury treatments while also warning about its toxicity. The knowledge that mercury was poisonous was always there, lurking in the margins of medical texts. But the hope that it could be made safe, that the right preparation or the right dose would unlock its healing potential without the harm, that hope overrode the evidence again and again. You know what this reminds me of? And tell me if you see the parallel too. It is like the way we sometimes hold on to beliefs even when the evidence contradicts them. We have all done it, right? Believe something so strongly that we explain away every piece of contradictory evidence, find reasons why this time it would be different. The physicians prescribing mercury were not evil, they were not even incompetent, not most of them. They were trapped in a paradigm, a way of seeing the world that made mercury make sense. And once you are in that paradigm, once you have built your understanding on certain assumptions, it is incredibly hard to step outside and see it clearly. It took the development of modern toxicology, the understanding of how heavy metals accumulate in tissue, the invention of better diagnostic tools, and the discovery of actual effective treatments before medicine could finally let go of mercury. But the legacy remains. Even today, mercury exposure is a serious public health concern. Do you remember hearing about Minamata disease? In the 1950s and 60s in Japan, a chemical company was dumping mercury into Minamata Bay. The mercury accumulated in fish. People ate the fish, and suddenly an entire community was suffering from mercury poisoning. Tremors, numbness, vision problems, brain damage. Children were born with severe disabilities. It was a modern echo of what physicians had been doing for centuries. Only this time, nobody was trying to heal anyone. It was just industrial negligence. But the mercury did not care about intentions. It poisoned people just the same. The story of mercury and medicine is a story about hope and desperation, and how dangerous that combination can be. It is about how the things that seem most magical, most transformative, most promising, are sometimes the things that will hurt us most. Those alchemists in their laboratories, watching mercury flow and shimmer, genuinely believed they were holding the key to transformation. And in a terrible way, they were right. Mercury does transform things. It transforms healthy tissue into damaged tissue. It transforms functioning organs into failing ones. It transforms the hopeful into the injured. The seduction of mercury was that it seemed to embody everything the alchemists were looking for. It was a metal that flowed like water. It evaporated like air. It could combine with other metals in mysterious ways. It seemed to exist between states, between categories, between the possible and impossible. But that beautiful, flowing silver poison taught medicine a hard lesson. Appearances can be deceiving. Elegance is not the same as efficacy. And sometimes the most promising cure is actually the most dangerous poison. The dose makes the poison, as someone once said. Someone we are about to meet properly, actually. A physician who used mercury himself, who made some of the same mistakes as everyone else, but who also started asking different questions, better questions. Questions about dose and toxicity and individual response. Questions that would begin to pull medicine away from alchemy and towards science. His name was Paracelsus. And if you think the mercury story was wild, just wait until you hear about this character. Controversial, brilliant, infuriating, revolutionary. He was a walking contradiction who changed medicine forever while also being wrong about almost everything. He burned books, insulted colleagues, got run out of multiple cities, and somehow became one of the most influential physicians in history. And his story, his strange and wonderful and tragic story, that is where we are heading next. Have you ever met someone who was right about the important things but absolutely insufferable about it? That was Paracelsus in a nutshell. Brilliant and arrogant, revolutionary and reckless. A man who saw further than almost anyone in his time, but who also could not seem to stop making enemies everywhere he went. His real name was Theophrastus Philippus Aureolus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Yes, Bombastus. And yes, that is where we get the word bombastic, meaning pompous, inflated, full of yourself. His own name became an insult in the English language. That should tell you something right there. But he did not use that name anyway. He chose Paracelsus, which roughly translates to equal to or greater than Celsus. Celsus was a famous Roman physician whose medical encyclopedia had been rediscovered during the Renaissance and was considered basically gospel. So this guy literally named himself better than the ancient master. Imagine introducing yourself at a party like that. Hi, I am better than everyone. Nice to meet you. He was born in 1493 in a tiny Swiss village called Einsiedeln, in a house right next to a bridge over the Sill River. His father was a physician and alchemist, not wealthy but educated, and young Theophrastus grew up watching his father treat patients and experiment with minerals. When Paracelsus was about 9 years old, his family moved to Villach in Austria, where his father became the town physician and also ran the local mines for a wealthy family called the Fuggers. And this is where something crucial happened that would shape Paracelsus's entire life. He spent time in those mines, not just visiting, but really observing, watching the miners work, seeing them get sick, watching some of them slowly deteriorate from breathing the air down there, from exposure to arsenic and mercury vapors, from silicosis turning their lungs to stone. Most educated physicians of his era would not have noticed. They would have stayed in their comfortable offices, reading ancient texts, never getting their hands dirty. But Paracelsus, maybe because his father made him, maybe because he was genuinely curious, he paid attention. And he started asking a question that seems obvious to us now, but was radical then. What if diseases do not come from imbalanced humors? What if they come from specific external causes that you can observe and identify? The miners were not getting sick because they had too much phlegm or not enough blood. They were getting sick because they were breathing poison, specific poisons that required specific treatments. This observation, this simple, direct, empirical observation, would become the foundation of everything Paracelsus believed about medicine. But he was not ready to announce his theories yet. First, he had to get an education. And this is where the legend of Paracelsus really begins, because he refused to get educated the normal way. He enrolled at the University of Vienna when he was about 16 to study medicine. He lasted maybe a year. The problem was that university medicine in the early 1500s meant one thing: memorizing ancient texts. Galen, the Roman physician from the 2nd century, Avicenna, the Persian polymath from the 11th century. These were not just studied, they were worshipped. Every word was considered sacred, unquestionable truth. But Paracelsus had seen miners dying from specific chemical exposures. He had watched his father experiment with mineral treatments. He had observed that sometimes the old remedies worked, and sometimes they failed spectacularly. And now these professors were telling him that a Roman physician from 1300 years ago had figured out everything there was to know about the human body. He called nonsense, loudly, repeatedly, in multiple universities. So he left. And here is where Paracelsus does something that I find genuinely admirable. He decides that if the universities will not teach him what he needs to know, he will learn it himself, by traveling, by observing, by doing. For the next decade or so, Paracelsus wandered Europe. He worked as a military surgeon in Italy, treating battlefield wounds. He visited mines in Sweden and Denmark. He learned from folk healers and midwives and barber surgeons, the people actually treating patients every day, not just theorizing about humors. He went to Spain, possibly even to North Africa and the Middle East. He collected remedies, techniques, observations. He wrote constantly, filling notebooks with what he saw. And he developed his philosophy, his revolutionary, infuriating, half-brilliant, half-crazy philosophy. Here was his central idea. The human body is essentially a chemical system. Diseases are caused by chemical imbalances or external chemical agents. Therefore, diseases should be treated with chemicals, specific chemicals for specific conditions. This was heresy, absolute heresy. Medicine had been based on the 4 humors for over 1,000 years: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Balance them through bleeding, purging, special diets, and you cure disease. That was the system. That was what every physician learned and practiced. Paracelsus said, forget the humors, they are not real. What is real is sulfur, mercury, and salt. Not literally those substances, but three principles they represent. Sulfur is the principle of combustibility of soul. Mercury is the principle of volatility of spirit. Salt is the principle of solidity of body. Disease happens when these three principles get out of balance. And you restore balance not by bleeding or purging, but by giving the body the right chemical medicine to correct the specific imbalance. Now, was he right? Kind of, sort of, in a way that would not be fully vindicated for another 300 years. The three principles thing was still alchemy, still mystical. But the underlying insight that specific chemicals can treat specific conditions, that the body is a chemical system, that was absolutely correct. That is modern pharmacology. And here is the really revolutionary part. Paracelsus said, "The dose matters." This is his most famous quote, and it is profound. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dose alone makes a thing not a poison. Think about what he is saying. There is no such thing as a purely good substance or a purely bad one. Water is essential for life, but drink too much and you will die. Arsenic is deadly poison, but in tiny doses it was used to treat some conditions. Mercury can kill you, but used carefully, externally, in the right amount, maybe it has some limited use. Everything depends on dose, on quantity, on application. This is toxicology. This is pharmacology. This is the foundation of scientific medicine. And Paracelsus figured it out in 1530-something by observing miners and experimenting with treatments, and refusing to just accept what the ancient texts told him. But here is the thing about being revolutionary. You make enemies. Lots of them. In 1527, Paracelsus finally got his big break. He was appointed town physician of Basel, Switzerland, and lecturer in medicine at the university there. This was a prestigious position. This was his chance to teach his ideas to the next generation of physicians. And what did he do on his first day? On June 5th, 1527, he posted a notice announcing his lectures. And then he went to the university courtyard, took the standard medical textbooks, Galen and Avicenna, and burned them, publicly, in front of students and faculty. Can you imagine? It would be like a new professor at Harvard burning the entire library on their first day and saying, "We are starting over." He announced that his lectures would be open to everyone, not just enrolled students, but also barbers, surgeons, apothecaries, anyone who wanted to learn. And he would lecture in German, not Latin, so regular people could understand. The faculty was apoplectic. You do not burn the sacred texts. You do not open lectures to commoners. You do not teach in the vernacular. Medicine is for educated gentlemen who have studied the classics, not for anyone off the street. But Paracelsus did not care. He said, and I love this quote, "I am different. Let this not upset you." Oh, they were upset. They were very upset. Students loved him, though. His lectures were packed. He spoke from experience, not just theory. He demonstrated actual procedures. He explained things in ways that made sense. He was probably the most engaging teacher at that university. But then Paracelsus did what Paracelsus always did. He picked a fight he could not win. A wealthy church official had been sick, and the canons of Basel asked Paracelsus to treat him. Paracelsus prescribed a new treatment, not bloodletting, not purging, but a specific remedy he had developed. And it worked. The patient recovered completely. So Paracelsus sent his bill, a substantial one, because he had cured a case the other physicians had given up on. The canons refused to pay. They said, "But you only gave him 3 pills. How can 3 pills be worth so much money?" Paracelsus sued them, and here is where it all fell apart. The court sided with the canons. After all, they were rich and powerful, and Paracelsus was an upstart with a reputation for insulting people. Paracelsus, never one to keep his mouth shut, started publicly calling the canons and the judges corrupt. He may have been right, probably was right, but you cannot call the legal system corrupt when you are a visiting professor with no real power base. He had to flee Basel in the middle of the night, his professorship gone, his chance to establish himself gone, back to wandering. And this became the pattern of his life. brilliant insights followed by spectacular self-destruction. He would arrive in a city, treat patients successfully, make a name for himself, and then insult the wrong person or challenge the wrong authority and have to move on. He invented laudanum, an opium tincture that would become one of the most important pain medications for the next 4 centuries. He wrote the first comprehensive book on occupational diseases, documenting how different jobs exposed workers to different hazards. He pioneered the use of chemical compounds in medicine: zinc, iron, copper sulfate, sulfur compounds. He was one of the first physicians to suggest that some mental illnesses might have physical causes, that maybe epilepsy was not demonic possession but a disorder of the brain. Revolutionary for his time. But he also believed in astrology. He thought the position of the stars when you were born determined your health. He made astrological talismans that he claimed could cure diseases. He had this whole theory about Arceus, a mystical life force that animated the body. Brilliant and ridiculous. Scientific and superstitious, all at the same time. And his personality did not help. There is a description of him that I find both sad and funny. He was short, had no beard, unusual for the time, and his voice was allegedly high-pitched and unpleasant. He wore shabby clothes when other physicians dressed in fine robes. He drank heavily. He never married. He was prickly, defensive, combative. Some historians think he might have had Klinefelter syndrome, a genetic condition that can affect physical development and temperament. Others think he was just naturally difficult. Either way, he was not an easy man to be around. His writings are fascinating but often incomprehensible. He would switch between brilliant clinical observations and mystical rambling, sometimes in the same paragraph. He wrote in this strange mix of German, Latin, and made-up words. He was convinced that if he could just explain his ideas clearly enough, everyone would understand. But he was perhaps the worst communicator in medical history. There is a line from one of his books that captures this perfectly. The best of our popular physicians are the ones that do the least harm. But unfortunately, some poison their patients with mercury, others purge them or bleed them to death. He is calling out the dangerous practices of his time. Good. But then he adds, and there are some who have learned so much that their learning has driven out all their common sense. Who is he talking about? Other doctors? Himself? Both? It is impossible to tell, because Paracelsus had absolutely no self-awareness. But here is what breaks my heart about Paracelsus. He was right about the important things. He was right that observation matters more than authority. He was right that specific chemicals can treat specific diseases. He was right that dose matters. He was right that diseases have physical causes we can study and understand. And he died poor and alone in Salzburg in 1541 at age 47 or 48. Some say he fell down a flight of stairs. Others suggest he was pushed. He had made so many enemies that murder was not out of the question. No wife, no children, no permanent position, no real recognition in his lifetime. Just a reputation as a difficult, heretical drunk who had attacked the foundations of medicine. But within a few decades, physicians started quietly adopting his ideas. They began using chemical medicines. They started thinking about dose-response relationships. They began questioning authority and making their own observations. They just did not always give him credit for it. By the 17th century, there was an entire movement called Paracelsianism. Physicians who followed his chemical approach to medicine while trying to make sense of his mystical rambling. Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, called him a pioneer of empirical psychological healing science. He became a legendary figure in the history of medicine. But none of that happened while he was alive. While he was alive, he was just the troublemaker who kept getting run out of towns. You know what I think about sometimes? What if Paracelsus had been just a little more diplomatic? What if he had learned to work within the system instead of constantly attacking it? What if he had found a wealthy patron who protected him, or a university that tolerated his eccentricities? Maybe he would have established a school, trained a generation of physicians in his methods, published clear, systematic textbooks instead of rambling manifestos, changed medicine 100 years earlier. Or maybe his fire, his absolute refusal to compromise, was what made him able to see what others could not. Maybe you need someone willing to burn the old books to make space for new ideas. I do not know. It is one of history's impossible questions. What I do know is that medicine needed Paracelsus, needed his observations, his experiments, his insistence that doctors should look at patients instead of just reading books, needed his understanding that the dose makes the poison, a principle that saves lives every single day. But it also needed his ideas to be filtered, refined, separated from the mysticism, and made systematic. And that took time, took other people, took the slow grinding of scientific progress. In the end, Paracelsus was a bridge, one foot still in the medieval world of alchemy and astrology, one foot stepping toward modern medicine, stuck in between, never quite belonging to either world. And while he was pioneering chemical medicine and questioning ancient authority, while he was being run out of Barcelona, wandering from city to city, other physicians were doing something that seems even stranger than anything we have discussed so far. They were prescribing pieces of human corpses as medicine, ground-up mummies, powdered skulls, human fat rendered into ointments. And they were not fringe quacks. They were mainstream, respected physicians. The practice had been going on for centuries, would continue for centuries more, and the reasoning behind it reveals something fascinating and disturbing about how people understood the human body, disease, and healing. So let us turn our attention from chemical cures to corpse cures, from the laboratory to the graveyard, and explore one of the strangest chapters in medical history. Walk into a 17th century apothecary shop in London, and you might notice something strange on the shelves. Between the dried herbs and the bottles of tinctures, a ceramic jar with a label that reads Mumia. Next to it, another labeled Cranium Humanum. Over there, a small container marked Oxungia hominis. Mummy powder, human skull, human fat. Not metaphors, not symbolic names for plant remedies, actual human remains, processed and packaged and sold as medicine. And this was not some underground black market operation. This was standard pharmacy, legal, regulated, recommended by the most respected physicians of the time. You could walk in with a prescription from your doctor, and the apothecary would measure out a dose of ground-up Egyptian mummy like they were measuring flour. The question that keeps me awake is not just why did they do this, it is how did this seem like a reasonable idea to anyone? Let us go back to where this started, ancient Rome. The gladiatorial arena again, but this time we are focusing on the spectators, not the fighters. The Romans had this belief, and it was not unique to them, versions of it existed in many cultures, that the human body contained a kind of vital force, a life energy. And if you consumed parts of someone who had died violently, someone whose life had been cut short while they were still strong and healthy, you could absorb some of that vitality. So after the gladiatorial games, people would rush down to the arena floor with cups, not for wine, for blood. Fresh blood from the fallen gladiators, still warm, to drink as a cure for epilepsy. The logic, such as it was, went like this. Epilepsy involves falling down, convulsions, loss of control. The gladiator was strong, controlled, vital until the moment of death. If you drink his blood immediately before that vitality disperses, maybe you absorb his strength and cure your weakness. It is sympathetic magic dressed up as medicine, but people believed it, and not just uneducated peasants. Physicians recommended it. There are documented accounts of epileptics being given priority access to fresh corpses, of families paying premiums for the blood of particularly strong gladiators. This was a market, an economy built on consuming the dead. But that was just the beginning, because at least gladiator blood was, let us call it, fresh. What came later was so much stranger. Fast forward to medieval Europe. Trade routes with Egypt and the Middle East have opened up, and European physicians start hearing about something called mumia or mumia, a bitumen-like substance from the Middle East that supposedly had remarkable healing properties. The original mumia was actually a natural petroleum product that seeped from rocks in Persia. It was black, sticky, and had been used in traditional medicine for various purposes. But somewhere along the way, and historians still debate exactly when and how this happened, someone got confused or deliberately conflated this natural substance with Egyptian mummies. Because, you see, Egyptian mummies were preserved with bitumen and various resins. They were dark, they were ancient, they came from the same general region. And if natural mumia was medicinal, well, maybe mummy mumia was even better. By the 12th century, definitely by the 13th, European physicians were explicitly recommending powdered Egyptian mummies as medicine, not the petroleum product, actual ground-up human corpses from ancient tombs. And the uses they claimed for it were extensive. Have a wound that will not heal? Apply mummy powder. Suffering from tuberculosis? Ingest mummy powder. Got the plague? You guessed it, mummy powder. Bruises, headaches, stomach problems, coughs, paralysis, even just general weakness. Mummy powder was the cure-all. An apothecary manual from the 16th century lists it right there alongside conventional herbs. The recommended dose was typically about 2 grams, mixed into a liquid or made into a paste. And this stuff was not cheap. Genuine Egyptian mummy powder could cost more than gold by weight, which created a problem. Because Egypt only has so many mummies, and if European doctors are prescribing this stuff for everything, and it costs a fortune, well, you can see where this is going. The mummy trade became big business. Professional tomb raiders in Egypt would break into ancient burial sites, sites that had been sealed for thousands of years, and strip them of their mummified contents. These were not archaeologists preserving history. These were entrepreneurs feeding European demand for corpse medicine. Ships would arrive in Venice and other Mediterranean ports loaded with mummified remains. Merchants would buy them wholesale, break them down, grind them into powder, and sell them to apothecaries across Europe. But even with industrial-scale tomb raiding, they could not keep up with demand. And when there is high demand and limited supply, what happens? Fraud. Massive, systematic fraud. Here is where it gets really dark, and I apologize because we are about to talk about something genuinely disturbing, but it is important to understand the depths of this practice. When Egyptian mummies became scarce or too expensive, suppliers started making their own. They would take recently dead bodies, sometimes from hospitals, sometimes from prisons, sometimes just unclaimed corpses of beggars and plague victims, and create artificial mummies. They would coat the bodies in bitumen and various resins, maybe add some spices to make them smell ancient, dry them in the sun or in ovens, and then sell them as genuine Egyptian mummies. A French royal surgeon named Ambroise Paré wrote about this in 1585, and his description is chilling. He wrote, "This wicked kind of drug does nothing help the diseased, and therefore I would counsel those that love their health not to take this kind of drug with others compounded, for fear lest we be compelled to devour the bodies of not only dead men, but also of thieves and men hanged, which were before brought out of Egypt." Think about what he is saying. The mummy powder being sold in pharmacies was not from ancient Egyptian royalty preserved with sacred rituals. It was often from executed criminals and destitute people, hastily processed and aged to look authentic. And people were consuming this for centuries. The practice continued well into the 18th century in most of Europe. In some places, mummy powder was still being sold as late as 1924. 1924, that is not ancient history, that is living memory. But mummy powder was not even the strangest form of corpse medicine. Let me introduce you to a particular gentleman who took this practice to new heights, or depths, depending on how you look at it. King Charles II of England, who ruled in the late 1600s, was fascinated by alchemy and chemistry. He had his own laboratory in Whitehall Palace. He experimented with various substances, and he had a favorite remedy that he supposedly took regularly. It was called the King's Drops. And here is the recipe. Take a human skull, specifically from someone who died a violent death. Executed criminals were preferred. Crush it into a fine powder. Mix this powder with alcohol and distill the mixture. The resulting liquid was considered a powerful restorative. The king drank it. He even shared it with favored courtiers. This was not some secret practice he was ashamed of. This was a point of pride. Look at my sophisticated medical knowledge. I have created an elixir from human remains. And the theory behind it, the old like cures like principle that we now call homeopathy, though they did not use that term yet. You have a headache? Your head hurts. Well, head medicine should cure it. Specifically, medicine made from someone else's head. Skull for headaches. Powdered skull mixed with specific herbs for epilepsy and apoplexy.
The reasoning was that the skull housed the brain, which controlled the body, so skull powder must contain some essence of control, of stability. It is magical thinking, but it is magical thinking done by the most educated, powerful people in Europe. And it was not just kings. Physicians across the social spectrum prescribed human body parts for specific conditions. Executioners, the people whose job was killing criminals, they had a profitable side business. After an execution, they would process the body. The fat would be rendered down, Alexandria, remember, and sold as an ointment for joint pain. The bones would be ground up. The skull would be powdered and sold to apothecaries. There was an entire economy around the corpses of executed criminals, and it was legal, regulated even. The executioner had rights to the body, could sell the parts, could make a decent living beyond their official salary. Sometimes people would specifically request to be buried quickly after death, precisely to avoid being dug up and turned into medicine.
Wills would include clauses about proper burial, fast burial, burial in locations that were hard to reach, because yes, grave robbing was absolutely a problem. Not just in the 19th century for anatomy students, that is relatively well known, but centuries earlier for the medical trade. Fresh corpses were valuable, particularly the corpses of people who died young and healthy from accidents, from violence, from anything except disease. The reasoning was that diseased corpses would transfer disease, but corpses of the healthy would transfer health. So there was a premium on the bodies of young people who had died in accidents, of executed criminals who had been healthy before their execution, of soldiers killed in battle. Ambrose Paré, that French surgeon I mentioned earlier, was appalled by all of this. His 1585 condemnation is worth quoting more fully because he really went after the practice. He wrote about apothecaries who, in the absence of superior mummy, were sometimes moved to steal by night the bodies of such as were hanged, and embalming them with salt, and in an oven, so to sell them thus adulterated instead of true mummy. Notice what bothers him most. Not that people are consuming human corpses, but that they are consuming the wrong kind of human corpses. That counterfeit mummies are being sold instead of genuine ones. His objection is quality control, not ethics. Though to be fair to Paré, he does go on to question whether any form of mummy medicine actually works. He was skeptical, but he was in the minority. Most physicians of his era would have said, well, of course you need genuine mummy, properly preserved, from Egypt. The fake stuff does not work because it lacks the proper preparation and age. But real mummy, that is effective medicine. Can you imagine being a patient in this era? You are sick, you trust your physician. He is educated, respected, has treated many patients, and he prescribes you a powder that you later learn is ground up human corpse. Some people knew what they were taking, others did not. The labels were not always clear, and many patients could not read anyway. They just took what the doctor ordered, not knowing they were practicing medical cannibalism. Because that is what it was, really, medicinal cannibalism. Not survival cannibalism, not ritual cannibalism, but the systematic consumption of human tissue for supposed health benefits. And it lasted for centuries. Centuries. That is what gets me. This was not a brief, strange fad. This was mainstream medical practice across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for roughly 500 years, maybe more. Why? How did this persist for so long despite the obvious lack of evidence that it worked? Part of it was the same reason any ineffective treatment persists: confirmation bias and placebo effects. If you believe skull powder will cure your headache, and you take skull powder, and your headache goes away on its own like headaches do, you will credit the powder. Part of it was economic. Too many people had too much invested in the mummy trade. The tomb raiders, the merchants, the apothecaries, the executioners, the physicians who had built their reputations on prescribing it. Admitting it was all nonsense would mean admitting they had been wrong. They had been engaging in grave desecration for profit. They had been feeding their patients ground-up criminals. But there was something deeper, too. The practice reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how disease works, how the body works, how medicine works. They believed in essences, in vital forces, in sympathies between similar things. They believed that properties could transfer through consumption in almost magical ways. They believed that death was a transformation, not an ending, and that the power of life could be captured and concentrated and consumed. None of that is true. Death is decay. Corpses do not contain vital essences. You cannot cure disease by eating parts of people who did not have that disease. The whole conceptual framework was wrong. But, and here is what is fascinating, they were doing chemistry. They were processing materials, extracting substances, testing dosages. They had quality control issues and worried about counterfeits. They kept records of which patients improved and which did not. They were being systematic and empirical and rational within a completely irrational framework. It was not until medicine started asking different questions, not which essence will balance this humoral imbalance, but what is actually happening in the body at a physical level, that corpse medicine began to fall out of favor. By the 19th century, most European physicians had stopped prescribing it. The last recorded sale of mummy powder was in Germany in 1924. And even that was probably just cleaning out old stock. Now we look back and we are horrified. We should be. The desecration of remains, the grave robbing, the exploitation of executed criminals, the deception of patients, all of it was wrong. But I also think we should be humble, because our great-great-grandparents might have used mummy powder. Our ancestors, not so distant, participated in or benefited from this practice. Smart people, caring people, people trying to heal the sick, they were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but they were doing their best with the understanding they had. What are we wrong about? What practices that seem perfectly reasonable to us now will horrify our descendants? That is the question that keeps me thinking. The story of corpse medicine is a story about desperation and hope, and how easily those two things can lead us astray. It is about the danger of accepting authority without evidence, about how economic incentives can perpetuate practices long after they should have been abandoned. But it is also a story about the slow, painful progress toward real understanding, each generation seeing a little more clearly, questioning a little more boldly, until finally someone says, wait, this is absurd. We are grinding up corpses based on magical thinking. Maybe we should stop. And medicine moved on, got better, became more scientific, more evidence-based, more effective. But that progress was not driven solely by men. While Paracelsus was burning books and tomb raiders were shipping mummies to Europe, there were women, often working in the shadows, sometimes in plain sight, who were making their own contributions to alchemy and medicine. Women whose stories have been largely erased from history, but who were every bit as curious, as innovative, as important as their male counterparts. And their story, the story of women in alchemy, is perhaps the most overlooked chapter of all. So let us shift our focus now from corpses to these forgotten pioneers. These women who practiced the art of transformation in laboratories, in kitchens, in secret spaces, often without recognition, sometimes without even having their names recorded. History has a way of forgetting women, does it not? Not always on purpose. Sometimes it is just that their work gets attributed to men. Sometimes their names get lost when manuscripts are copied. Sometimes they are reduced to footnotes, the wife of, the sister of, as if their relationship to a man is more important than their actual achievements. But in the world of alchemy, something even stranger happened. Women were so thoroughly erased from the historical record that for centuries people genuinely believed alchemy was an exclusively male pursuit, which is remarkable, considering that some of the most important innovations in the field came from women's laboratories. Let me tell you about someone who lived 16 centuries ago, whose work influenced alchemists for 1,000 years afterward, but whose identity is so mysterious that we are still not entirely sure she was even one person. Her name, or the name attributed to her work, was Cleopatra. Not the famous Egyptian queen who loved Caesar and Mark Antony. This was Cleopatra the Alchemist, who lived and worked in Alexandria around the 3rd century AD, roughly 300 years after her more famous namesake died. We know almost nothing about her life. Was she Egyptian, Greek, a single person, or a collective using one name? All we have is a single surviving manuscript attributed to her work, and it is one of the most baffling documents in the history of alchemy. It is called the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra,
the gold-making of Cleopatra. And when you look at it, you do not see recipes or procedures or neat instructions. You see symbols, circles within circles, a serpent devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros we talked about earlier. 3 separate images of this symbol, actually, each with different inscriptions. One of them reads, Hen to Pan, the all is one. A philosophical statement about the unity of matter, the idea that all substances are fundamentally the same thing in different forms, and that transformation is possible because of this underlying unity. But here is what is fascinating. This is not just philosophical musing. Embedded in these symbolic images are practical instructions for alchemical procedures, but they are encoded so thoroughly that you need to already know what you are doing to understand them. It is a text that assumes expertise, not a beginner's manual, which tells us something important about Cleopatra. She was writing for other practitioners, other alchemists, who would understand the symbolism. She was part of a community, and that community apparently included her as a respected voice, respected enough that her work was copied and preserved for centuries. But we do not know what she looked like. We do not know if she had students. We do not know if she made any breakthroughs, discovered any new techniques, succeeded in any of her transmutation experiments. All we have is this one cryptic manuscript, and the knowledge that other alchemists considered her important enough to reference. Some historians think Cleopatra the Alchemist might have been a pen name, possibly used by multiple people. Others think she was a real individual whose biographical details simply were not recorded because, well, why would they record details about a woman? Either way, she represents something important. Proof that women were practicing alchemy at the very beginning when the art was first being systematized in Alexandria. Now jump forward about 1,300 years. We are in Renaissance Italy, in the city of Forlì, and there is a woman who is absolutely not hiding her alchemical work. In fact, she is famous for it. Her name was Caterina Sforza, and she was a force of nature. Born around 1463 into one of the most powerful families in Italy, the Sforzas controlled Milan, she was educated in Latin, philosophy, and the classics. Not common for women of any class, but the elite sometimes educated their daughters, especially if they were planning advantageous marriages. And oh, did Caterina make advantageous marriages. Her first husband was Girolamo Riario, the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. That marriage made her the Countess of Forlì and Imola. When her husband was assassinated, Renaissance Italy was violent, she defended her fortress, kept her territories, and ruled in her own right. But what I find most fascinating about Caterina is not her political maneuvering or her military prowess. It is what she was doing in her private chambers when she was not defending cities or negotiating with popes. She had a laboratory, a serious laboratory, with all the equipment we talked about earlier, alembics, furnaces, crucibles. And she had a garden, a special herb garden where she grew plants specifically for her experiments. Caterina was obsessed with 2 things, cosmetics and medicine. And to her, they were not that different. Both were about transformation, taking base materials and turning them into something that could beautify or heal the human body. She kept detailed notes, experiments, recipes, observations. And after her death, these notes were compiled into a manuscript called Experimenti, Experiments. Over 450 recipes. Remedies for wounds, cures for fevers, treatments for various ailments, hair bleaching formulas. European aristocrats were obsessed with blonde hair. Skin lightening creams, because pale skin was fashionable. Perfumes, lotions, ointments. This was not dabbling. This was serious, systematic work. She was testing combinations, noting what worked and what did not, refining her formulas. And here is what I love about Caterina. She did not hide this. She was not working in secret, afraid of being called a witch or accused of heresy. She was a countess, powerful in her own right, and she treated her alchemical work as a legitimate intellectual pursuit. She would gift her creations to other nobility. Here, I made this perfume using a technique I developed. Try this ointment for your skin. She built her reputation partly on her political acumen and partly on her skill with alchemical preparations. But, and there is always a but with women in history, after she died in 1509, her manuscript was not published. It circulated in handwritten copies among nobility, but it did not get the formal publication and scholarly attention that male alchemists' works received. It was treated as a curiosity, the hobby of a noblewoman, rather than a serious contribution to alchemical knowledge. Which brings up something that happened constantly in Renaissance alchemy. Men would publish books under female names to make them more marketable. Wait, what? Yes, you heard that right. In an era when women were generally excluded from intellectual pursuits, publishers discovered that books about beauty, cosmetics, and household alchemy sold better if they were attributed to aristocratic women. There is a famous example, a book called I Secreti della Signora Isabella Cortese, The Secrets of Lady Isabella Cortese, published in Venice in 1561. It is full of alchemical recipes, how to make gold, how to create medicines, cosmetic preparations, perfumes. The introduction claims it was written by Isabella Cortese, a noblewoman who traveled throughout Europe and learned secrets from various masters. It became a bestseller, was reprinted multiple times, translated into other languages. But most historians now think Isabella Cortese never existed. The actual author was probably a man named Girolamo Russelli, and he used a female pseudonym because books about cosmetic alchemy sold better when women wrote them. Can you see the irony? Real women like Katharina Sforza were doing serious alchemical work, but were not taken seriously. Meanwhile, male authors were pretending to be women because that made their books more profitable. Women's voices were valuable as a marketing tool, but not as actual intellectual contributions. It is frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. But some women broke through anyway. Let me tell you about Christina, the girl king of Sweden. She was born in 1626, and her father was King Gustav II Adolf. He had been hoping for a son, but he got Christina, and he decided to raise her as if she were a prince. She got the education a crown prince would receive: languages, philosophy, military strategy, history, theology. When her father died in battle when she was 6 years old, Christina became queen. Not queen consort, not regent, actual queen of Sweden. She was crowned at age 18 in 1644. And Christina was brilliant. She spoke or read 7 languages. She brought artists and scholars to her court. She corresponded with philosophers like Descartes. She was intensely curious about everything, including alchemy. When she was about 20, she met an alchemist named Johannes Frank, and he introduced her to alchemical philosophy. Christina became fascinated, not so much with making gold, she was already rich, but with the philosophical and spiritual dimensions of alchemy. She studied the Rosicrucians, that mystical movement that combined Christianity, Hermeticism, and alchemical thought. She collected alchemical manuscripts. She may have done some practical work herself, though the records are unclear. What is remarkable is that Christina, as queen of one of Europe's great powers, could openly study alchemy without being accused of witchcraft or devil worship. Her position protected her, but it also meant that her interest in alchemy was treated more as an eccentric royal hobby than a serious intellectual engagement. In 1654, Christina did something almost unprecedented. She abdicated the throne. At age 28, she gave up being queen, converted to Catholicism, Sweden was Lutheran, and moved to Rome. For the rest of her long life, she lived until 1689, she devoted herself to patronizing arts and sciences, including continued study of alchemy. But again, her actual contributions to alchemical knowledge are not well documented. We know she studied it, we know she funded alchemists. But we do not know what she discovered, what experiments she conducted, what insights she had, because nobody thought to record it in detail. She was a queen with interesting hobbies, not a serious practitioner. This is the pattern we see over and over. Women doing alchemy, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. Sometimes their work is documented but dismissed as domestic craft rather than serious science. Sometimes their names are attached to work they did not do as marketing gimmicks. Sometimes they are erased entirely, their contributions attributed to male colleagues or family members. There was a woman in 16th century Prague named Anna Maria Zieglerin who worked as an alchemist at noble courts. She claimed to have created successful transmutations, to have discovered secrets of the philosopher's stone. She was taken seriously enough to receive patronage and laboratory space.
But when her promised results did not materialize, when the gold she claimed to have made turned out to be fake, she and her husband were executed for fraud. Would a male alchemist have been executed for failed experiments? Hard to say, but the standard seemed different for women. They had to prove themselves constantly, and failure carried higher stakes. Here is what really gets me about the women in alchemy. They were fighting two battles simultaneously. First, the same battle everyone was fighting, trying to understand nature, trying to develop effective medicines, trying to unlock the secrets of transformation. And second, the battle to be taken seriously, to have their work recorded and preserved, to be seen as more than hobbyists or frauds or witches. And most of them lost the second battle, even when they were winning the first. How many women made discoveries that were attributed to their husbands or brothers? How many developed techniques that were stolen or claimed by male colleagues? How many wrote manuscripts that were lost or destroyed because nobody thought women's alchemical writings were worth preserving? We will never know. The evidence is gone. The names are forgotten. The work has been absorbed into the general history of alchemy without attribution. But I think about them sometimes. Women in laboratories, or more likely in kitchens, because that is where women were allowed to work with substances and fire. Women carefully documenting their experiments in notebooks that were later thrown away. Women teaching their daughters the secrets of distillation and extraction, passing down knowledge that would never be formally acknowledged. The kitchen, was actually the perfect cover, because women were supposed to be cooking, preserving food, making medicines for household use. So if you were a woman interested in alchemy, you could pursue it under the guise of domestic work. Who would question a woman spending hours in her kitchen, heating substances, mixing compounds, distilling liquids? That is just what women did. Except some of them were not just making dinner. They were pursuing the same questions the male alchemists in their fancy laboratories were pursuing. They just had to do it in spaces and ways that would not get them accused of overstepping their place. The irony is rich, is it not? The equipment of alchemy, the stills, the mortars and pestles, the heat sources, these were all common kitchen tools. Alchemy grew out of cooking, out of brewing, out of the domestic arts. And then, as it became more formalized, more prestigious, more scientific, women were gradually excluded from it, until by the time we get to the 18th and 19th centuries, when alchemy is transforming into chemistry, women are almost entirely written out of the story. Chemistry becomes a male domain, taught in universities where women are not allowed, and the female alchemists, the ones who were there at the beginning, the ones who contributed techniques and ideas and observations, they are forgotten. But they were there, in Alexandria and Baghdad and Prague and London and Uppsala, in palaces and cottages, in laboratories and kitchens, working, experimenting, thinking, discovering. And somewhere in the manuscripts that survive, in the anonymous texts and the recipes attributed to a wise woman or a lady of quality, their voices are still there, encoded, waiting to be heard. We have talked about laboratories and Mercury and corpse medicine and revolutionary physicians and forgotten women, but there is one figure we have not properly met yet, a name that appears again and again when people talk about alchemy. A man whose legend grew so large that it swallowed his actual life whole. A man who supposedly discovered the secret of immortality and then either died or faked his death or is still alive somewhere, depending on who you ask. His name is Nicholas Flamel, and his story is the perfect example of how historical facts and alchemical myth become so entangled that they are almost impossible to separate. So let us try to untangle them, to figure out who the real Nicholas Flamel was and how he became the most famous alchemist in history, despite probably never practicing alchemy at all. The most famous alchemist in history probably never practiced alchemy. That is the truth that nobody wants to hear, is it not? Because Nicholas Flamel's story is so perfect, so romantic, so exactly what we want from an alchemical legend. The humble scribe who discovers a mysterious book, decodes its secrets, creates the philosopher's stone, achieves immortality, and walks among us still. Except almost none of that is true, but the lie is so much more interesting than the truth. So let us start with the truth, the documented, historical, somewhat boring truth, and then we will talk about how that truth transformed into one of the most enduring legends in Western culture. Nicolas Flamel was born around 1330, probably in Pontoise, a town northwest of Paris. We do not know his exact birth year, and we do not know much about his early life, because, well, he was not important enough for anyone to write about. He moved to Paris sometime in his youth and established himself as a scribe, not a writer in the creative sense, a professional copyist. In an era before printing presses, if you wanted a copy of a book, someone had to write it out by hand. That was Nicolas's job. He ran a small shop near the church of Saint Jacques de la Boucherie. The church is mostly gone now, only the tower remains, the Tour Saint-Jacques that still stands in Paris. But in the 14th century, it was a busy parish in a busy neighborhood, and Nicolas's shop did well enough. He also worked as a bookseller, dealing in manuscripts and possibly as a public writer, someone who wrote letters and documents for people who could not write themselves. These were respectable, modest professions. He was not poor, but he was not wealthy either. Then, around 1368, Nicolas married a woman named Pernelle. She was a widow, already married twice before. And here is the important part: she had money, property, assets from her previous marriages. After their marriage, Nicolas and Pernelle became notably wealthier. They bought several properties in Paris. They made generous donations to the church, endowing chapels, funding renovations, paying for masses to be said for souls in purgatory. These donations were substantial, well documented, and they got noticed. People started asking, where is this money coming from? A scribe does not earn that kind of wealth. Is Nicolas involved in something else? And here is where we need to be honest about medieval real estate. Paris in the late 1300s was a growing city. Property values were rising. If you bought the right buildings at the right time, if you knew which neighborhoods were developing, you could make a fortune. Nicolas and Pernelle appeared to be very good at real estate speculation. They bought properties, rented them out, sold them at profit, bought more. This is not mysterious, it is just smart business. But it is not romantic. It does not make for a good story. Local scribe makes wise investments does not capture the imagination. Pernelle died in 1397. Nicolas lived another 21 years, continuing to manage his properties, make donations, live comfortably. He died in 1418, at around age 88, quite old for the time, but not impossibly old, not suspiciously old. He was buried in Paris. We know where because his tombstone still exists. It is in the Musée de Cluny now. You can go see it. The inscriptions are worn but readable. He planned his funeral, wrote his will, left most of his library to a nephew named Perrier.
This is not the behavior of someone who has achieved immortality and is planning to fake his death. And for about 150 years after Nicolas Flamel died, that was the story. Successful scribe, good businessman, generous donor, respectable citizen. The end. But then something strange started happening. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, books started appearing that claimed to be written by Nicolas Flamel. Books about alchemy, books revealing the secrets of the Philosopher's Stone, books describing his journey to decode a mysterious manuscript and achieve immortality. The first major one was published in 1612 in Paris, nearly 200 years after Flamel died. It was called Livre des Figures Hiéroglyphiques, the Book of Hieroglyphic Figures, and the publisher claimed it was Flamel's own account of his alchemical discoveries. The story it told was captivating. According to this book, in 1357, about 11 years before he married Pernelle, Nicolas Flamel purchased a strange book from a desperate man who needed money. The book cost 2 florins, which was cheap for a book. But this was not an ordinary book. It was made not of paper or parchment, but of what appeared to be bark from young trees. The cover was brass, engraved with mysterious symbols. It was titled The Book of Abraham the Jew, and claimed to be written by Abraham for his scattered people to help them pay tribute to Rome. The text was in a language Flamel could not read. The pages were filled with bizarre illustrations: a serpent swallowing rods, a cross with the serpent crucified, a desert with fountains flowing, roses and serpents everywhere. Flamel supposedly spent years trying to decode the book.
He showed it to scholars in Paris, but none could help. Finally, according to the legend, he decided to make a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, hoping to find a Jewish scholar who could translate it. Spain still had Jewish communities before the expulsion of 1492. On his way back from Santiago, he met a merchant in Lyon who told him of a Jewish physician named Master Conchus, a converso, a Jew who had converted to Christianity. Flamel sought out Conchus, showed him the book, and Conchus was thrilled. He had heard of this book, thought it was lost forever. Conchus began translating it for Flamel, but, dramatic pause, he died before they could finish. Flamel returned to Paris with the partial translation, and over the next 3 years worked with Purnell to decode the rest. And on January 17, 1382, according to the book, at exactly noon, Nicholas Flamel successfully transmuted half a pound of mercury into silver. On April 25th of that same year, he transmuted mercury into gold. He had done it. He had created the Philosopher's Stone. It is a perfect story, is it not? The mysterious book, the impossible quest, the faithful wife helping with the experiments, the moment of triumph. It has everything except evidence. Any evidence at all that it actually happened. The book published in 1612 was almost certainly written by the publisher himself, a man named Pierre Arnauld de la Chevalerie, who saw an opportunity. Alchemical books sold well. Books supposedly written by people who had actually succeeded at alchemy sold even better. And Nicholas Flamel was perfect. Dead long enough that no one who knew him was still alive, successful enough to seem plausible, documented enough to seem real. Why would a publisher do this? Money, obviously, but also something else. In the early 1600s, there was a huge revival of interest in alchemy. The Rosicrucian movement was spreading across Europe, promising secret wisdom and transformation. Rulers were funding alchemists. Everyone wanted to believe that someone, somewhere, had actually succeeded. Nicholas Flamel became that someone, the proof that it was possible. More books followed, all attributed to Flamel. La philosophie naturelle, the philosophical summary. Le désir désiré, the desired desire. None of them written by him, all of them claiming to reveal his secrets. And people believed it. They wanted to believe it. Because if Nicholas Flamel could go from humble scribe to master alchemist, then maybe anyone could. Maybe the secret was out there, just waiting to be found. The legend grew. Details were added. Someone claimed that Nicholas and Purnell had not actually died. They had faked their deaths and fled to India to live out their immortality in peace. Someone else said they had been spotted in Paris in the 18th century, centuries after their supposed deaths. There is a particularly wonderful claim from the 1700s that Nicholas and Purnell were seen attending a performance at the Paris Opera House in 1762. They were recognized, reportedly, and disappeared into the crowd. Just think about that for a moment. It is 1762. Nicholas Flamel would be over 430 years old. And he and his wife are just going to the opera, living it up in Paris, enjoying a night out after 4 centuries of immortality. Not hiding somewhere remote, not avoiding attention, but attending public performances. It is absurd. It is delightful. And apparently, some people took it seriously. Isaac Newton, yes, that Isaac Newton, owned alchemical manuscripts that reference Flamel. Newton spent years studying alchemy, filling notebooks with observations and theories, and he believed Flamel might have succeeded. One of Newton's journals mentions the caduceus, the dragons of Flamel. When one of the greatest scientific minds in history is taking your legend seriously, that lends it considerable credibility. By the 19th century, Flamel had become a fixture in European culture. Victor Hugo referenced him in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The composer Eric Satie was fascinated by him. Freemasons adopted him as a symbolic figure. He appeared in novels, plays, philosophical treatises. And then in 1997, a young British author named J.K. Rowling made him the creator of the Philosopher's Stone in her first Harry Potter book. Suddenly, Nicholas Flamel was introduced to millions of readers worldwide, most of whom had no idea he was based on a real person.
Now, here is what I find most fascinating about all this. The legend of Nicholas Flamel tells us more about the people who created and perpetuated it than it does about Nicholas himself. Every era that embraced the Flamel legend was going through something. The 17th century publishers were capitalizing on Rosicrucian fervor and alchemical revival. The 18th century opera sightings came during the Enlightenment, when people were fascinated by the tension between rational thought and mysterious possibility. The 19th century Romantic movement loved the idea of hidden wisdom and mystical knowledge. And we, in our time, are drawn to the idea that magic might be real, that there might be secrets that science has not explained.
Nicholas Flamel, the man, was ordinary, successful but ordinary. But Nicholas Flamel, the legend, he represents something we desperately want to believe, that transformation is possible, that immortality is achievable, that somewhere out there, someone has figured it all out. The real tragedy is not that Nicholas did not create the Philosopher's Stone, it is that we will never know what he actually thought about any of this. Did he have any interest in alchemy? Did he study it as a hobby, read alchemical texts among the many manuscripts he handled? Or was he completely focused on his business, his real estate, his donations to the church? We do not know, and because we do not know, the legend had room to grow. You can still visit Nicholas Flamel's house in Paris, you know. It is on Rue de Montmorency, number 51, built in 1407. It is one of the oldest stone houses in the city. There is a restaurant there now, called Auberge Nicholas Flamel. The building has an inscription from when Nicholas built it, asking those who pass by to pray for the poor and the dead. Nearby is Rue Nicholas Flamel, a street named after him. It intersects with Rue Pernelle, named after his wife. In modern Paris, this ordinary medieval couple has been immortalized in the city's geography. Their tombstone, as I mentioned, is in a museum. Their house is a tourist attraction. Books continue to be written about them, films, TV shows, video games. Nicholas Flamel appears everywhere, usually as the keeper of immortality's secret. And maybe that is its own kind of immortality, is it not? Not the literal kind he supposedly achieved, but the cultural kind. Nicholas Flamel has lived in human imagination for over 600 years. His name carries weight, mystery, possibility.
The scribe who probably never practiced alchemy became its most famous practitioner. The businessman who made his money in real estate became the symbol of transmutation itself. It is fitting in a way, because is that not exactly what alchemy was always about? Not the literal transformation of lead into gold, but the transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary, the mortal into the immortal, the mundane into the magical. Nicholas Flamel, the man, died in 1418. Nicholas Flamel, the legend, will probably never die. And that transformation continues. We are still reaching, still seeking, still trying to understand more, to heal more, to transform suffering into flourishing. The great work continues, just not the one the alchemists imagined. The death of alchemy did not happen in a dramatic moment. There was no single day when everyone suddenly decided to stop believing. Instead, it faded gradually, like dawn, slowly revealing that the shadows you feared in the night were just ordinary furniture all along. But if we had to mark a turning point, a moment when the balance tipped decisively from alchemy to chemistry, we might choose a night in May 1774, a spring evening in Paris, and a man conducting an experiment that would change everything. His name was Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier, and he was about to become known as the father of modern chemistry. Though ironically, he would lose his head to the guillotine 20 years later during the French Revolution. But that is another story. Lavoisier was born in 1743 into a wealthy Parisian family. He received an excellent education in law, sciences, and mathematics. He was brilliant, meticulous, and skeptical of received wisdom. Exactly the kind of person alchemy needed to move beyond mysticism. On that May evening in 1774, Lavoisier was heating mercury in a closed container. He had been heating it for days actually, watching it slowly transform into a red powder, what we now call mercury oxide. Other alchemists had done this experiment.
They had seen Mercury transform into something else and believed they were witnessing transmutation, the changing of one substance's essential nature into another's. This is what alchemy was all about, right? Transformation. But Lavoisier asked different questions. When mercury transformed into the red powder, did its weight change, and what happened to the air in the sealed container? He weighed everything obsessively: the mercury before heating, the red powder after heating, the container, the air, everything. And he made a remarkable discovery. The red powder weighed more than the mercury he had started with, but the total weight of the closed system, container, powder, and remaining air, stayed exactly the same. The mercury had not transformed by gaining some mystical essence. It had combined with something from the air, a specific something that could be isolated and measured. Lavoisier called it oxygen. Not because he coined a term, that is complicated, but because he proved it existed as a distinct substance with measurable properties. This was revolutionary. This was chemistry, not alchemy. Alchemy said, mercury transforms because we have altered its spiritual nature through heating, through adding fire, through mystical processes. Chemistry said, mercury combines with oxygen through a predictable chemical reaction. The total mass is conserved, we can write an equation. We can replicate this anywhere.
Do you see the difference? It is profound. Lavoisier went further. In 1789, he published Traité élémentaire de chimie, Elementary Treatise of Chemistry. In it, he did something that seems simple but was actually revolutionary. He listed elements. Not earth, air, fire, and water, not sulfur, mercury, and salt, real physical elements that could not be broken down further. He listed 33 of them. Some were actually compounds we later split into elements, but the principle was correct. Oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, sulfur, phosphorus, zinc, iron, silver, gold. Real substances with real properties that could be measured, weighed, and studied systematically. And crucially, he showed that these elements combined in specific proportions. Water was not a fundamental element. It was 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen, H2O. Always that ratio, everywhere in the universe. This was the death blow to alchemical thinking. Because if substances were combinations of measurable elements in fixed proportions, then you could not transmute lead into gold by changing its spiritual essence. Lead was lead, a specific arrangement of atoms. Gold was gold, a different arrangement. And you could not change one into the other through heating, prayers, or mystical processes. Well, technically you can transmute lead to gold through nuclear reactions by changing the number of protons in the nucleus, but that requires particle accelerators and enormous energy, and it costs far more than the gold is worth. So the alchemists' dream of easy transmutation was definitively wrong. Lavoisier's chemistry spread rapidly across Europe. Other scientists built on his work. John Dalton developed atomic theory. Dmitri Mendeleev created the periodic table.
The foundations of modern chemistry solidified quickly once people started asking the right questions. And medicine followed. Once physicians understood that diseases had physical causes, bacteria, viruses, genetic defects, chemical imbalances, they could develop targeted treatments. Not treatments based on mystical correspondences, but treatments based on understanding how the body actually works. The 19th century saw an explosion of medical progress. Anesthesia that actually worked safely. Ether and chloroform, not deadly nightshade. Antiseptics, understanding that cleanliness prevented infection. Vaccines, teaching the immune system to recognize threats. The germ theory of disease, finally understanding what actually caused illness. By the early 20th century, medicine had been completely transformed. Antibiotics, X-rays, blood typing, vitamins, hormones. One breakthrough after another, each based on scientific understanding rather than mystical belief. But here is what I want you to remember. None of this would have been possible without alchemy. I know that sounds paradoxical. Alchemy was wrong about almost everything. So how did it contribute to modern medicine? Think about it this way. The alchemists developed laboratory techniques that are still used today. Distillation, filtration, crystallization, sublimation. These are fundamental chemical processes that alchemists refined over centuries. They developed equipment. Alembics became distillation apparatus. Athanors became furnaces. Mortars and pestles, balances, crucibles. The basic tools of chemistry came from alchemy. They documented everything. For all their mystical language and symbolic thinking, alchemists were compulsive record keepers.
They wrote down what they did, what happened, what they observed. That documentation, once translated from mystical terms into chemical terms, contained centuries of empirical data. They asked important questions, even if their answers were wrong. What are things made of? Can substances be transformed? What makes people sick, and how can we heal them? These questions drove exploration, experimentation, and eventually led to correct answers. And perhaps most importantly, they refused to just accept authority. Yes, many alchemists cited ancient texts and revered figures like Hermes Trismegistus, but the best alchemists, people like Paracelsus, even with all his flaws, insisted on observation and experimentation over pure theory. Do not just read Galen, Paracelsus said. Look at actual patients, try actual treatments, see what actually works. That attitude, that insistence on empirical observation, is the foundation of science. Alchemy gave birth to chemistry, not despite its failures, but because of them. Each failed experiment taught something. Each wrong theory eventually led to someone asking, but what if we are thinking about this wrong? The transformation from alchemy to chemistry mirrors human development itself, does it not? We start with magical thinking as children, believing our thoughts can influence reality, that wishes might come true, that the world operates on principles of justice and meaning. Then we grow up. We learn about cause and effect, about physical laws, about randomness and complexity. And it can feel like losing something precious. The world becomes less magical, more mechanical. But here is the thing. The world becomes more comprehensible. And comprehensible means we can actually help people. We can cure diseases.
We can reduce suffering. We can extend life. The alchemists wanted to defeat death and transform the world. They failed at their impossible goals, but succeeded at something more valuable. They laid the groundwork for real medicine, real chemistry, real understanding. That is a kind of transformation more powerful than any they imagined. Think about where we started tonight, with Emperor Qin Shi Huang swallowing mercury pills, dying in his quest for immortality. With ancient Egyptian alchemists grinding minerals in Alexandria, seeking the secrets of transformation. And now we have antibiotics that cure infections that would have been death sentences for 99% of human history. We have vaccines that protect against diseases that once killed millions. We have an understanding of the human body at the molecular level that would seem like genuine magic to any alchemist. We still do not have immortality. We still cannot turn lead into gold profitably. The philosopher's stone remains mythical. But we have something the alchemists never dreamed of. Systematic, reliable, reproducible knowledge about how the physical world actually works. And that knowledge has given us power beyond any alchemist's wildest fantasies. Modern medicine is imperfect. We still do not have cures for everything. People still suffer and die from diseases we do not fully understand. There is still so much we do not know. But we know so much more than we did. And we are still learning. The transformation continues. You know what I find most beautiful about this story? The continuity. That bain-marie you might use in your kitchen, named after Mary the Jew, an alchemist from the 3rd century. That aspirin you take for a headache, derived from willow bark that alchemists studied. That essential oil in your diffuser, extracted using techniques refined by alchemists seeking mystical essences. The past is not separate from the present. It flows into it, shapes it, becomes it. Those ancient seekers with their furnaces and cryptic symbols, they are connected to modern chemists with their spectrometers and computers. The questions changed, the methods improved, but the fundamental human impulse to understand, to heal, to transform remains constant. And maybe that is the real philosopher's stone. Not a physical substance that transmutes metals or grants immortality, but the human drive to push beyond current understanding, to try seemingly impossible things, to believe that transformation is possible. The alchemists were right about that at least. Transformation is possible, not in the mystical sense they imagined, but in the real practical sense we have achieved. We transformed ignorance into knowledge, suffering into healing, mystery into understanding. That is alchemy that actually works. That is magic that is real. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe think about that. Think about the long, strange journey from Egyptian workshops to modern hospitals. Think about all the people along the way, the geniuses and the charlatans, the successes and the failures, the brilliant insights and the catastrophic mistakes. Think about Paracelsus burning books in Basel because he believed observation mattered more than authority. Think about Katerina Sforza in her laboratory, mixing remedies in her fortress. Think about Nicholas Flamel, the scribe who never practiced alchemy, but whose legend inspired centuries of seekers. Think about Rudolf II in Prague, desperate and hopeful, funding both frauds and genuine researchers. Think about Rudolf II in Prague, desperate and hopeful, funding both frauds and genuine researchers. Think about all the patients who suffered through mercury treatments and mummy powder and powdered beetle remedies, who trusted their physicians and hoped for healing. Think about the alchemists who spent lifetimes in smoky laboratories, genuinely believing they were on the verge of unlocking reality's deepest secrets. They were wrong about the specifics, but they were right about the possibility of understanding. Right that persistent curiosity could reveal truth. Right that the universe operates according to principles we can discover. And their collective failure, their magnificent, productive, world-changing failure, gave us the tools and knowledge to actually heal, to actually understand, to actually transform the human experience. That is a legacy worth remembering, worth honoring, worth continuing. The alchemists did not fail. They just succeeded at something different from what they intended. And in the end, what they actually achieved was far more valuable than what they sought. They sought the philosopher's stone and found chemistry instead. They sought immortality and found medicine instead. They sought magic and found science instead. And science, properly understood, is more wondrous than any magic could ever be. So thank you for joining me on this journey tonight, through laboratories filled with mysterious vapors, past emperors and frauds and forgotten women, across centuries of seeking and failing and learning, from the first Egyptian alchemist heating cinnabar in Alexandria to Lavoisier weighing mercury in Paris, from mysticism to medicine, from magic to science. And science, properly understood, is more wondrous than any magic could ever be. So thank you for joining me on this journey tonight, through laboratories filled with mysterious vapors, past emperors and frauds and forgotten women, across centuries of seeking and failing and learning, from the first Egyptian alchemist heating cinnabar in Alexandria to Lavoisier weighing mercury in Paris, from mysticism to medicine, from magic to science. It has been quite a journey, has it not? I hope you sleep well. I hope your dreams are filled with wonder rather than worry. And I hope that when you wake tomorrow, you will see the world a little differently. See the long, strange, beautiful path that brought us from there to here. Because every time you take medicine that works, every time you benefit from scientific understanding, you are inheriting the legacy of those alchemists. Their questions, their techniques, their refusal to accept that understanding was impossible. They reached for the impossible and gave us the possible. They sought transformation and became transformed themselves, from mystics into the ancestors of scientists. And that transformation continues. We are still reaching, still seeking, still trying to understand more, to heal more, to transform suffering into flourishing. The great work continues, just not the one the alchemists imagined. Thank you for listening. Thank you for wondering with me. Thank you for walking this strange path through history. And rest assured, there are more stories to come. More journeys through the fascinating, surprising, sometimes disturbing chapters of human history. More questions about how we got from there to here. More reminders that the past is never as simple as we think, and the present is never as disconnected from it as we assume. But for now, rest. Dream well. And maybe, just maybe, dream of transformation. The real kind. The kind that actually happens when curious humans refuse to stop asking questions. Good night. Sleep well, and I will see you in the next story.